Marielle Duchamp had worked the front desk of the Verant Hotel for 5 years, long enough to know that the difference between a good day and a bad one usually announced itself before 9 in the morning, in the particular tension of whoever walked through the lobby doors first. She arrived at 6:30 that Thursday, an hour before her shift technically began, because she'd learned early in her tenure that arriving early gave her time to review the overnight logs properly, to catch whatever small discrepancies the night staff might have missed before they became larger problems by mid-morning. The Verant occupied a restored Beaux-Arts building downtown, marble floors and gilt fixtures that had once signaled understated old money and now, under 2 years of Desmond Hale's ownership, signaled something closer to aggressive, anxious ambition. A hotel trying considerably too hard to convince itself it belonged in a tier it hadn't quite earned yet. She'd built her entire professional identity around the kind of competence that rarely announced itself, memorizing returning guests' room preferences before they finished stating their names, smoothing over double bookings and maintenance complaints with a calm, practiced efficiency that had earned her genuine loyalty from the hotel's regular clientele, even as that same competence seemed to earn her nothing but scrutiny from the man who owned the building she worked in. She'd grown up in a family that measured worth by usefulness rather than appearance, a lesson that had served her reasonably well until she'd entered an industry obsessed with exactly the opposite calculation. An industry where her size, however unrelated to her actual job performance, seemed to arrive in every conversation with Desmond as a problem requiring a solution she couldn't provide by working harder. Brand fit, he called it, always delivered with the same careful, deniable phrasing that let him avoid saying the quiet part directly. He'd mentioned it during her first performance review, framed as constructive feedback about the image we're building. He'd mentioned it again during the renovations planning stages, a passing comment about wanting the front desk to project a specific kind of polish that Marielle had understood, immediately and painfully, wasn't actually about polish at all. She'd absorbed each comment with the same disciplined calm she brought to every difficult guest interaction, understanding that her excellent service record was the only currency she had to spend against Desmond's obvious, persistent discomfort with how she looked doing her job. The investors arrived at 10 that morning for a scheduled walkthrough of the near-complete renovation. 6 men and 2 women in expensive, understated clothing that Marielle recognized immediately as the specific uniform of people evaluating whether their money was being spent wisely. Desmond met them in the lobby with the particular, performed warmth he reserved exclusively for people whose approval mattered to his bottom line, gesturing toward the newly restored ceiling moldings, the marble reception counter that had been polished to a blinding shine for exactly this occasion. Marielle worked the desk through the walkthrough with her usual careful attention, checking in a small stream of guests while Desmond narrated the renovation's progress to his investors 20 feet away, the two conversations running parallel until a booking system glitch, a known issue during the renovation's final data migration, flagged twice already in the maintenance logs Marielle had reviewed that morning, caused a guest's reservation to show as cancelled instead of confirmed. This is unacceptable. The guest, a well-dressed man traveling for a conference, kept his voice controlled but pointed, loud enough to carry toward the investor group without quite becoming a scene on its own. I confirmed this reservation 3 weeks ago. I have the email confirmation right here. I understand, sir, and I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. Marielle kept her voice steady, already pulling up the system's error log to confirm what she already suspected. This is a known glitch from our ongoing system migration, not an error on your part. Give me just a moment and I'll have you checked in properly with a complimentary upgrade for the trouble. She was already resolving it, the fix taking shape efficiently under her practiced hands, when Desmond's attention snapped toward the desk with a speed that told her, immediately, that his investors had noticed the guest's frustration before she'd had the chance to fully resolve it. He crossed the lobby with quick, decisive steps, his expression carrying the particular brittle anxiety of a man who needed to perform competent management in front of an audience whose confidence he couldn't afford to lose. What is the meaning of this? His voice arrived sharp enough to carry across the entire lobby, drawing every head within earshot. A system error from the migration, Mr. Hale. I'm already resolving it. The slap landed before she finished the sentence, Desmond's palm connecting across her face with a crack that seemed to swallow every other sound in the lobby, the impact snapping her head sideways hard enough that she had to catch herself against the marble counter to keep from stumbling. This is exactly the kind of incompetence I will not tolerate. Desmond's voice climbed further, performing decisive authority for his watching investors even as the act itself betrayed something considerably uglier than decisiveness. Do you understand what's at stake here? Do you understand what this hotel is trying to become? The lobby had gone entirely silent, the particular suspended silence of witnesses who understood immediately that they just watched something that crossed a line no amount of investor pressure could justify. Marielle stood rigid, her cheek burning, her hand pressed flat against the counter's cool marble surface, absorbing the humiliation the same way she'd absorbed every smaller cruelty across 5 years. Without visible reaction, without the satisfaction of tears Desmond seemed in that moment to be hoping for. She didn't cry out. She didn't retreat. She simply stood there in front of guests and co-workers and the very investors Desmond had been so desperate to impress, absorbing a public humiliation that had nothing to do with the actual error and everything to do with a man's need to perform control he didn't actually possess. A chair scraped quietly against marble somewhere near the lobby's seating area, and a man Marielle hadn't fully registered until this moment rose from his seat with an unhurried, deliberate calm that immediately, completely reshaped the room's entire temperature. Constantine Aldrich crossed the lobby without hurrying, his pace carrying the particular unbothered confidence of a man who'd never once needed to raise his voice to command a room's full attention, and Marielle felt every eye in the lobby track his movement with an instinctive collective recognition that whatever happened next carried weight considerably beyond an ordinary guest's opinion. He stopped a few feet from the desk, close enough to address both Marielle and Desmond without appearing to choose sides prematurely, his expression carrying none of the performed outrage the moment seemed to invite. "Who touched her?" He said it evenly, quietly, the question arriving with a controlled precision that made clear he already knew the answer and was asking anyway, deliberately, for reasons that had nothing to do with genuine confusion. Desmond's bravado faltered instantly, his earlier performed authority collapsing into something considerably more uncertain the moment Constantine's attention settled fully on him. "I'm sorry, I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm the owner of this hotel, and this is an internal staffing matter that doesn't concern." "Who touched her?" Constantine repeated the question with the exact same even tone, offering no acknowledgement of Desmond's deflection whatsoever, his patience carrying an absolute, immovable quality that made clear he had no intention of accepting anything other than a direct answer. The investors, sensing the room's power dynamic shifting in real time, had gone quiet in a considerably different way than the earlier, stunned silence following the slap itself. Watchful now, calculating, several of them exchanging glances that suggested they'd already begun recalculating their confidence in Desmond's judgment. "I did." Desmond finally said it, the admission arriving thin and considerably less certain than anything he'd projected moments earlier. There was an error, a serious service failure in front of these investors, and I felt decisive action was necessary too. Decisive action. Constantine let the phrase hang in the air for a beat, something almost imperceptible shifting in his controlled expression, a contempt so precisely calibrated it barely registered as an emotion at all. "You struck an employee across the face in public over a booking error that clearly wasn't her fault, judging by how quickly she was already resolving it when you interrupted her." He turned his attention fully toward Marielle for the first time, his voice softening slightly, though the underlying steadiness remained entirely unchanged. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." Marielle kept her voice level despite the lingering sting across her cheek, old instinct urging her to smooth over the moment, to protect her position by minimizing what had just happened in front of the very people whose confidence Desmond needed. "It's not necessary to." "It's entirely necessary." Constantine's attention returned to Desmond, and something in his controlled composure carried an unmistakable, quiet danger now, the specific authority of a man who rarely intervened in matters outside his direct concern and had clearly decided in this exact moment that this particular matter had become his concern regardless. "I'd like your full name, Mr. Hale, and I'd like to understand exactly what disciplinary consequence you intend to face for what every person in this lobby just witnessed. With respect, sir, I don't believe you have any standing to." "I checked into this hotel this morning under a private reservation." Constantine's voice stayed level, though the words carried a deliberate, unmistakable weight. "I have every standing a paying guest has, to expect the staff serving me won't be assaulted in the lobby by the man who owns the building. I'd suggest you consider very carefully what you say next, in front of the people you were apparently hoping to impress this morning. The investors' quiet had shifted again, several of them now watching Desmond with an open, unmasked skepticism that suggested his earlier performance of decisive management had entirely backfired, transformed instead into a liability he clearly hadn't anticipated when he'd struck first and calculated consequences second. Desmond's expression cycled through several failed attempts at recovery before settling into something considerably smaller, considerably more careful. "I apologize if my reaction seemed excessive," he said finally, the words arriving stiff and reluctant, clearly aimed more at salvaging the investor's confidence than at any genuine remorse toward Marielle herself. "It won't happen again. See that it doesn't." Constantine's tone made clear the conversation had ended entirely on his terms, and he turned back toward Marielle with an attentiveness that carried genuine concern rather than performance. "I'd like a few minutes of your time whenever your shift allows it. Not about the reservation. I simply want to make sure you're actually all right once the adrenaline of this moment has settled." Marielle finished her shift that evening with her cheeks still faintly tender, the physical sensation fading considerably faster than the lingering, uncomfortable awareness of every coworker's careful, sympathetic glances throughout the remainder of the day, the specific exhaustion of being simultaneously the center of everyone's attention and entirely unable to discuss what had actually happened without risking her job further. She found Constantine waiting in the small lounge off the lobby at the end of her shift, exactly as he'd said he would, his posture carrying the same unhurried calm she'd witnessed that morning, though something in his expression now read as genuinely, quietly attentive rather than commanding. "You didn't have to wait." Marielle settled into the seat across from him, uncertain exactly what this conversation was meant to accomplish, old instincts warning her against trusting a wealthy stranger's sudden, inexplicable interest in her well-being. "I wanted to." Constantine studied her with an attention that carried none of the assessing quality she usually braced for from guests who noticed her at all. "I've been turning this morning over since it happened. I don't often intervene in matters that aren't directly my concern. I find myself unable to simply let this one go, and I'm still working out exactly why that is." "You don't need to explain yourself to me." Marielle kept her voice carefully professional, understanding that whatever gratitude she felt toward his intervention didn't automatically require her to extend trust toward whatever came after it. "I appreciate what you did this morning. I do. But I'd rather this not become something considerably larger than it needs to be. I still work here. I still need this job. I understand that concern." Constantine's voice carried genuine acknowledgement rather than dismissal. "I'm not asking you to make this larger than you're comfortable with. I simply want you to know that if Mr. Hale retaliates against you in any way for what happened this morning, quietly or otherwise, I intend to know about it and I intend to respond." "Why?" The question arrived more directly than Marielle had planned, though something in his careful, unguarded sincerity made the bluntness feel appropriate rather than rude. "You don't know me. You checked into this hotel this morning. Whatever happened between me and my employer isn't actually your responsibility to fix." Constantine considered the question seriously, taking his time with the answer in a way that struck Marielle as genuine rather than calculated. "I've spent most of my adult life around people who calculate exactly what a gesture will cost them before they ever offer it," he said finally. "I watched a man strike someone smaller than himself in public, to perform authority for people whose money mattered more to him than her dignity. I don't have a complicated answer beyond that. It mattered to me watching it happen, and I don't think that obligates me to walk away simply because intervening isn't technically my responsibility." Marielle absorbed the answer carefully, something in its plain, unguarded honesty easing her wariness slightly, though not fully. "I appreciate that," she said finally. "I do. I just ask that you not extend your stay or make special requests specifically about me. I don't want to become a project for a wealthy guest who happened to witness something upsetting. I've had enough of my dignity handled by other people's decisions for one day." "That's a fair request." Constantine met her eyes with genuine respect for the boundary. "I'll extend my stay regardless for reasons that have nothing to do with you specifically. But I won't make special requests that put you in an uncomfortable position. If our paths cross again during that stay, I'd like it to be because you're comfortable with that, not because I've engineered it." The following days settled into an uneasy rhythm, Desmond's public apology giving way within a week, to a colder, more distant treatment that Marielle recognized immediately as retaliation dressed up as professional distance. Smaller shifts, less desirable assignments, a subtle but unmistakable narrowing of the responsibilities she'd built her 5-year reputation on. Constantine's presence in the hotel continued, careful and respectful exactly as promised, brief, genuine conversations during her shifts that never once crossed into the territory of special treatment she'd asked him to avoid. "You've been given the overnight desk 3 times this week." Constantine observed it during one such conversation, his tone carrying careful concern rather than intrusion. "That's not your usual schedule, is it?" "It's not." Marielle kept her voice measured, understanding the observation for the genuine concern it carried rather than idle curiosity. "I think Mr. Hales found a way to make my life difficult without technically doing anything he could be held accountable for. Overnight shifts aren't punishment on paper. They're just considerably harder on an actual person's life." "I see." Something focused and quiet settled into Constantine's expression, though he said nothing further about it in that particular moment, and Marielle understood, watching him absorb the information, that whatever came next wouldn't be something she'd asked for directly, though it also wouldn't be something she could easily stop once it began moving. Desmond's retaliation accelerated 3 weeks after the lobby incident, arriving not through further schedule manipulation but through a formal termination notice delivered by the hotel's human resources director on a Tuesday morning, citing a manufactured pretext about a supposed cash drawer discrepancy that Marielle understood immediately, with a cold, sinking clarity, had been fabricated specifically to remove her before Constantine's obvious interest could develop into something Desmond couldn't control. "This is absurd." Marielle kept her voice steady despite the panic building beneath her composure, studying the termination paperwork with an attention that immediately identified inconsistencies in the alleged drawer count, discrepancies in dates and figures that didn't match her own careful 5-year record of scrupulous accuracy. "I've never once had a documented cash handling issue in 5 years. This doesn't match any procedure we actually follow." "I understand this is difficult, Ms. Duchamp." The HR director's voice carried genuine discomfort, the particular unease of someone delivering an instruction they clearly didn't fully believe in themselves. Mr. Hale reviewed the discrepancy personally and made the final determination. "I'm sorry, but the decision's already been finalized." Marielle left the hotel that afternoon with a small box of personal belongings and a termination letter that felt, in her hands, like the culmination of every small accumulated cruelty she'd absorbed across 5 years of excellent unrecognized service, understanding with a bitter clarity that Desmond had finally found a way to remove the problem her continued presence apparently represented to him, timed precisely to happen before anyone with genuine authority could intervene. She called Constantine that evening, uncertain whether reaching out crossed a boundary she'd carefully maintained since their first conversation, though the unfairness of the termination pushed past her earlier reluctance. "He fired me," she said without preamble, the words arriving raw despite her efforts to keep her voice controlled. "A manufactured cash discrepancy that doesn't match anything in 5 years of my actual record. I think this is retaliation for what happened in the lobby, time to happen before you could do anything more direct about it." Silence stretched on the line for a moment, something audibly shifting in Constantine's composure. "I already know," he said finally, his voice carrying a controlled certainty that surprised her. "I've been quietly acquiring a controlling stake in the Varence ownership structure since the week of the incident. The paperwork was finalized 2 days ago. I was planning to tell you once the process was fully complete, but given what's just happened, I think the timing requires moving considerably faster than I'd originally planned." "You bought the hotel." Marielle absorbed the information slowly, understanding its full weight arriving in careful increments. "Because of what happened to me in the lobby. Because of what happened to you and because of what it revealed about how Mr. Hale actually runs this property when he believes no one with real authority is paying attention." Constantine's voice carried absolute, focused determination. "I don't do things halfway, Marielle. Watching him strike you and then watching him retaliate against you weeks later through a fabricated pretext confirmed everything I needed to know about whether this property's ownership structure required intervention. I have the authority now to reverse this termination entirely, and I intend to use it tonight, before Desmond has time to finalize anything further. I didn't ask you to buy a hotel on my behalf." Marielle felt something complicated move through her chest, genuine gratitude tangled with old, familiar discomfort at the scale of what he'd apparently done, however well-intentioned. That's considerably more than I ever expected from anyone stepping in on my behalf. I didn't do it entirely on your behalf if I'm honest, Constantine said carefully. I do considerable business in this city, and a property with this kind of exposure to litigation, staff mistreatment, and poor operational judgment was already a liability I'd been evaluating before the lobby incident ever happened. What you experienced simply confirmed the timeline needed to move considerably faster than my original assessment suggested. I'm not asking you to feel indebted to me for a decision that served my own interests as much as it served yours. Desmond learned of Constantine's controlling stake the following morning, summoned to an emergency meeting by his own board of directors with a curtness that told him, immediately, exactly how thoroughly his position had shifted beneath him without his full awareness. You fired an employee under a fabricated pretext, 3 weeks after publicly assaulting her in front of investors whose confidence we're actively trying to secure. The board's chairman, a careful, measured man named Aurelio Ferris, laid the situation out with a bluntness that carried genuine alarm beneath its controlled delivery. And you did this without understanding that the man who witnessed the original incident had already begun acquiring enough shares to hold majority control of this property's board. I had no way of knowing his intentions. Desmond's voice carried genuine panic now, understanding the full scope of his miscalculation arriving in real time. The termination was a legitimate business decision unrelated to. It was not a legitimate business decision, Desmond, and I'd strongly advise against continuing to insist otherwise in front of people who now have full access to Ms. Duchamp's actual employment record. Aurelio's voice carried a controlled finality that made clear the board's patience had already run its course. Mr. Aldrich has requested a formal meeting this afternoon to present evidence regarding both incidents. I'd suggest you prepare yourself for a conversation considerably more consequential than anything you've navigated with this board before. Constantine arrived at that afternoon meeting with a folder of carefully assembled documentation, witness statements from lobby staff who'd observed both the original slap and the subsequent pattern of retaliatory scheduling, a forensic review of the cash drawer discrepancy that revealed, unmistakably, the fabrication's clumsy inconsistencies, and formal confirmation of his own newly acquired majority stake in the property's ownership. I'd like this documented clearly for the board's record, Constantine said, laying the evidence across the conference table with the same controlled, methodical precision he'd shown in the lobby weeks earlier. Mr. Hale struck an employee in public, then retaliated against her over the following weeks through punitive scheduling changes, and finally terminated her employment using a fabricated cash discrepancy that doesn't match a single inconsistency in 5 years of her otherwise spotless record. Desmond's composure, already fraying considerably since the morning's summons, finally, completely collapsed under the weight of evidence he couldn't argue against. I made an error in judgment, he said, his voice carrying none of the authority he'd once commanded in this same boardroom. I'm prepared to apologize to Ms. Duchamp directly, and to reconsider the termination. You're not in a position to reconsider anything, Mr. Hale. Constantine's voice carried an absolute, unwavering finality. As of this morning, I hold majority control of this property's ownership. I'm removing you from all operational authority, effective immediately, and I'm reinstating Ms. Duchamp personally, with full back pay for every day of unjust termination and every week of retaliatory scheduling that preceded it. You can't simply. I can, and I already have. Constantine slid a final document across the table, the formal paperwork of Desmond's operational removal already prepared and finalized. I'd suggest you consult your own attorney before considering any further response, though I'll tell you plainly, I have considerably more resources and considerably more patience than whatever legal challenge you're currently calculating whether to mount. The board's remaining members absorbed the confrontation with a visible, growing understanding of exactly how thoroughly the property's ownership structure had shifted, several of them exchanging glances that suggested genuine relief at watching Desmond's authority dissolve in real time rather than continuing to threaten the property's reputation and legal standing. Marielle learned of the outcome that same evening, Constantine arriving at her apartment with the finalized paperwork in hand, his expression carrying a controlled satisfaction tempered by genuine care for how she might actually receive the news. It's done, he said simply. Desmond's removed from all operational authority. Your terminations reversed with full back pay for everything you've lost these past weeks. I wanted you to hear it from me directly, not through a formal letter that would make this feel like something that happened to you instead of something you actually earned. Marielle sat with the paperwork for a long moment after Constantine left it in her hands, feeling the accumulated weight of 5 years, the careful, disciplined absorption of every small cruelty, the public humiliation that had finally, unexpectedly cracked open into something considerably larger than she'd ever imagined possible, settle into something she hadn't fully expected to feel amid the relief. I need to ask you something honestly, she said, meeting his eyes directly. Is this reinstatement genuinely about my actual work, or is it about you feeling responsible for what happened in that lobby? I need to understand the difference, because I don't want a position I only hold because someone with considerable power decided to feel guilty on my behalf. Constantine considered the question with genuine seriousness rather than the reflexive reassurance she'd half expected. Both things can be true simultaneously, he said finally. I do feel a responsibility toward what I witnessed. I won't pretend that's not part of why I moved as quickly as I did. But the reinstatement itself and everything I intend to offer beyond it is based entirely on your actual record. 5 years of documented excellence, guest testimonials that specifically name you as the reason they continue choosing this property. A service record that Desmond himself, before all of this, never once disputed on its merits. He met her eyes steadily. I'm not offering you a position out of guilt. I'm restoring a position you never should have lost, based on work I've now had considerable time to review properly. What happens to the hotel now? Marielle studied him carefully, understanding this question carried weight beyond her own immediate circumstances. A full operational restructuring, starting with new leadership that actually understands hospitality as a genuine practice rather than a performance for investors. Constantine's voice carried the same focused determination she'd witnessed throughout the past weeks. I'd like you to be part of that restructuring in a considerably more substantial role than the front desk position you held before. Guest relations leadership with real authority over how this property actually treats the people working within it. That's a considerable jump. Marielle felt something complicated move through her chest, old caution warring against genuine, cautious hope. I appreciate the confidence, but I'd want it to be based on an actual evaluation of whether I'm right for that scope of responsibility, not just gratitude for what happened. Then we'll structure it as a trial period with clearly defined benchmarks, exactly the way any legitimate promotion should be handled. Constantine's willingness to negotiate the terms rather than simply insist on his original offer settled something in Marielle's remaining wariness. I'm not interested in you accepting anything you don't genuinely believe you've earned. I think you have based on everything I've reviewed. But I understand why you'd want the structure to prove that, rather than simply take my word for it. The formal transition unfolded over the following 2 weeks, Marielle stepping into her new role with the same careful, disciplined competence that had defined her 5 years at the front desk, now finally extended into a scope of authority that matched the actual quality of her judgment. She restructured the guest relations team's training protocols, addressed long-standing staff grievances that Desmond had ignored for years, and watched with a quiet, private satisfaction as the hotel's actual service quality began improving in ways that had nothing to do with marble floors or investor confidence and everything to do with treating both guests and staff with genuine, consistent respect. The formal announcement of the Variant's new leadership structure arrived 3 weeks later, delivered to the full staff in the same lobby where Desmond had struck Marielle weeks earlier. The space transformed now by an atmosphere considerably lighter than the anxious, performed tension that had characterized every previous investor walkthrough. Constantine stood before the assembled staff with Marielle beside him, though the arrangement carried none of the performed hierarchy that had once defined similar gatherings under Desmond's ownership. I want to be direct about why this restructuring happened, Constantine said, addressing the room with the same controlled, genuine authority he'd brought to every previous confrontation. This property's previous ownership treated its staff as expendable when convenient and valuable only when performing for investors. That culture ends today permanently, starting with genuine accountability for what happened in this exact lobby several weeks ago. He turned toward Marielle, something warm entering his controlled expression despite the formal setting. Ms. Duchamp has been promoted to Director of Guest Relations, with full authority over staff training, guest experience protocols, and any future concerns regarding how this property treats the people who make it actually function. This isn't a symbolic gesture. It's a recognition of 5 years of documented excellence that should have been recognized considerably sooner than a public assault finally forced anyone to notice it properly. The staff's response carried a genuine collective warmth that Marielle hadn't fully anticipated, several co-workers who'd witnessed the original incident approaching her afterward with quiet, sincere congratulations that carried none of the careful, guarded distance her position had once required from her. "You earned this," one longtime housekeeping supervisor told her, gripping her hand with genuine emotion. "We all watched you handle every impossible situation Desmond created for 5 years without ever once losing your composure. I'm glad someone with actual power finally noticed what the rest of us already knew." Marielle found Constantine near the lobby's restored fireplace once the gathering had dispersed, the same seating area where he'd first risen to confront Desmond weeks earlier. "I keep thinking about that morning," she admitted, settling into the chair across from him. "How close I came to simply absorbing what happened, the way I'd absorbed everything else for 5 years if you hadn't stood up." "I think about it too." Constantine studied her with the same genuine attention he'd offered from that very first conversation in the lounge. "Not because I need credit for standing up. Because watching you in that moment, the way you didn't cry out, didn't retreat, just stood there absorbing something no one should have to absorb, told me everything I needed to know about the kind of person actually running this hotel's day-to-day operations, regardless of whose name was on the ownership documents. I don't know how to thank you properly for all of this." Marielle met his eyes honestly, the gratitude arriving without the old discomfort that had characterized her earlier hesitation. "A promotion, a restored reputation, an entire hotel's culture shifted because you happened to be sitting in that lobby at exactly the wrong moment for Desmond and exactly the right moment for me. You don't need to thank me for recognizing what was already true." Constantine's voice carried genuine sincerity. "I simply acted the moment it mattered instead of waiting until after the fact to decide it was worth the trouble. That's not generosity, Marielle. That's just what should have happened, the instant it became clear what kind of man Desmond actually was underneath his careful performance." 6 months later, Marielle stood in her new office overlooking the Varant's restored lobby, reviewing quarterly guest satisfaction metrics that had climbed steadily since the leadership transition, watching the hotel's actual reputation finally begin matching the polished, ambitious image Desmond had always claimed to be building through considerably less honest means. The staff turnover that had plagued the property under Desmond's ownership had slowed to nearly nothing, several employees who'd left during his tenure reaching out to inquire about returning once word spread through the industry about the property's genuinely restructured culture. Marielle had rebuilt the guest relations training program from the ground up, incorporating the same disciplined, careful attention to detail that had defined her own 5 years at the front desk, teaching an entire new generation of staff that competence and dignity weren't separate things to be traded against each other depending on whoever happened to be watching. Constantine appeared in her office doorway that afternoon, a habit that had grown gradually into something considerably more comfortable than the careful, respectful visits that had characterized their earlier months working together. "The quarterly numbers are exceptional," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Guest retention up considerably, staff turnover down to nearly nothing, and the investors who witnessed that lobby incident have all specifically cited your leadership as the reason they've maintained their confidence in this property. I told you the numbers would follow if the culture actually changed." Marielle allowed herself a small, genuine smile, something that had become considerably easier around him over these past 6 months than the careful, guarded professionalism she'd maintained in their earlier conversations. "It's satisfying, honestly, watching this property finally become what it always claimed to be capable of being, instead of just performing that potential for people with money to spend. That's exactly what it's become because of the specific choices you've made running it." Constantine studied her with the same genuine attention he'd offered consistently since that first difficult morning in the lobby. "I keep thinking about how close this entire outcome came to never happening. If I'd been seated somewhere else that morning, if I hadn't happened to witness exactly what Desmond was capable of when he believed no one with real authority was paying attention." "I think about that too." Marielle met his eyes honestly, the observation arriving with a clarity that had settled fully into place over these past 6 months. 5 years of absorbing exactly that kind of treatment, and it took one stranger choosing to actually notice, in the moment it mattered, to change everything that came after. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. I keep wondering what would have happened if you hadn't stood up. Whether I'd still be at that front desk, still absorbing whatever came next, still believing that was simply the cost of keeping a job I couldn't afford to lose. I don't think you'd have stayed quiet forever. Constantine's voice carried genuine conviction. I think you'd have found your own way to change your circumstances eventually, the same disciplined resourcefulness that got you through 5 years of exactly this kind of mistreatment. I just happened to be in a position to accelerate that change considerably faster than it might have happened otherwise. Maybe. Marielle reached across the desk, an easy, natural gesture that had grown comfortable over months of steadily accumulating trust. But I'm glad it happened the way it did. I'm glad you were the one sitting in that lobby, and I'm glad you chose to stand up the moment it actually mattered, instead of deciding afterward that it wasn't your place to get involved. I'd like to think I'd have made the same choice regardless of who was standing at that desk. Constantine held her hand with a gentleness that carried none of his usual careful, measured composure. But I'm glad it was you specifically. Not because of anything that happened afterward. Because I've spent 6 months watching you run this property with a level of genuine integrity I've rarely encountered anywhere in my life. And I don't think that would have surprised me even if we'd never once developed anything beyond a professional relationship. Marielle looked at him across her desk, the lobby's restored, genuine warmth visible through her office window below, and felt the accumulated weight of 5 difficult years. The careful, disciplined absorption of cruelty she'd never once deserved. The public humiliation that had somehow, unexpectedly, become the exact moment everything finally changed, settle into something steadier and more hopeful than she'd allowed herself to feel in longer than she could measure. She thought of every quiet indignity she'd absorbed at that front desk, every small cruelty dressed up as constructive feedback about brand fit, and understood finally, completely, that her worth had never actually been in question. It had simply taken someone paying genuine attention at exactly the right moment, to make everyone else finally see what had been true all along. If you'd spent years absorbing quiet cruelty for the sake of keeping a job you couldn't afford to lose, would you have found the same disciplined strength Marielle did, standing rigid through a public humiliation? Or would the moment have finally broken something you'd been holding together for far too long? Thank you for reading. There are more stories like this one waiting whenever you're ready for them.